Alright guys, hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to talk to you about a little guy by the name of Hans Schmidt. And no, I don't mean the priest that was arrested and executed for the murder of somebody. I don't know, I googled it, it's scary and disturbing. Anyways, I'm talking about the Hans Schmidt of LeadChess.org. This guy, as you can see on the screen, is better than 100% of rapid players, 100% of blitz players, and 100% of bullet players. So that's pretty good. Of course, this is the anonymous account of a very strong grandmaster. I don't want to be added to the list of people who outs him for who he really is. But all you need to know, this guy is super duper strong, and you can just tell that by looking at those Lead Chess ratings. Now, why am I talking about him? Well, I had the pleasure of playing him in some 10-minute rapid games. There I was, getting home from work, scrolling through my phone, when I decided maybe I'll play some chess, which turns out to have been a big mistake because I got absolutely slaughtered by this guy in the 8 games that we played. I did want to talk to you about a pretty interesting game that we did play. And, you know, I don't want to spoil anything, but who knows what happened in this one? Maybe I lost the first 7. Maybe something different happened in Game 8. You never know. Game 8, though, is the one that I want to show you. And here it is. It is myself with the white pieces and Hans Schmidt on Lead Chess with the black pieces. I started the game with 1c4. Now, those who know me know I normally play the move d4, but let me tell you, this Hans Schmidt guy, he's just the most incredible Grunfeld player of all time, apparently, and he was just destroying me every single game in the Grunfeld. So I played c4, trying something different. He plays the move b6, and now I take the opportunity to go back to stuff that I know with the move d4. After bishop b7, Hans is looking to guard a lot of these light squares, so I play knight c3, kind of countering black's claim on these squares. Now knight f6 is natural development, and I choose a pretty interesting line here. In many Queen's Indian defenses, you'll see black play e6, bishop b4, and something like knight e4, going for control of this e4 square. For that reason, I chose not to play the move knight f3, and instead played pawn to f3 with the idea that I can control this square first before black ever gets the chance. Now black is actually in a little bit of danger of just getting rolled over in the center here. If e4 comes, black is going to have a tough time catching up with all of this space. So Hans went for more Grunfeld type positions with the move d5. I went ahead and captured. Black retakes back. I continue with e4, which is very natural. And now a capture on c3 is played. And we once again find ourselves in some Grunfeld-like positions, right? We see the d5, the knight takes on c3, very Grunfeld-esque. And in the spirit of the Grunfeld, my opponent actually chose to play the move g6 and bishop g7. Unfortunately, I don't think this is actually the best way for black to continue here. In the database, I was looking, and it turns out by far the most popular moves are either e6 or even more common is e5. These moves that control the center very, very directly and very immediately are usually how black wants to respond to this, right? Because white just has such a massive center, and the moves b6, bishop b7, you know, while they do sometimes appear in the Grunfeld, I'm not sure they're the most helpful here against this f3, e4 setup. But what we have in the game is g6. Now, thanks to the move order, I have a very interesting option to develop the bishop, not to e2, not to d3, not even to c4, but instead all the way out to b5. Of course, bishop e2 struggles because it gets in the way of the knight. Bishop d3 gets in the way of the queen. Bishop c4 I think is generally fine, but bishop b5 check is a really nice way to sort of interrupt the flow of black's pieces. Why is this? Well, there's no comfortable way to block this check with the bishop already on b7. With the bishop on c8, it would love to block on d7, but with bishop b7 played, bishop c6 is not really the way black wants to go. Why is that? Well, I'll simply retreat, and this bishop is in the way of both this knight and this pawn. So black plays pawn to c6 instead, hitting the bishop, and I drop back to a4. The game continues with development, bishop g7, knight e2, castles, castles, and now that black has broken the pin on the c-pawn, he can continue with the natural move c5. I just develop my pieces, bishop e3, and now queen c7 comes on the board. And natural moves here would be rook c1, not d1 rather, but rook c1, just putting the rook opposite the queen. In the game, I tried a little bit of a strange idea by moving the bishop again to f4. Of course, this is hitting the queen on c7. You could argue this is a mistake to move the bishop twice in the opening, but I was kind of hoping black would play this move e5. This is what I was kind of going for here, because I thought I had a good position after bishop g3. Why is that? Well, e5 actually gets in the way of black's own bishop, and I would want to follow up with d5, when all of a sudden this bishop isn't really doing anything, this bishop isn't really doing anything, and I have a nice little protected passed pawn in the center. But this wasn't meant to be. Hans Schmidt decided to play queen c8 instead, just stepping out of the way. But now, of course, my wasted tempo with the bishop is met by another wasted tempo by black. Now I continue the game with d5, which I think is a good move in this case. Sometimes this move is not so good for white in the Grunfeld, because it does open up this bishop, but here I think the benefits sort of far outweigh the downsides of opening up this bishop. What are the benefits? Well, this bishop can't really see very far now. It sort of is stuck looking at this pawn. And for the moment, I'm actually preventing this knight from getting developed to the natural square of c6 as well. Furthermore, if my knight ever lands on d4 after a move like c4, I'm going to be able to look at this c6 square. Sort of remnants of the first game I uploaded to YouTube, showing their face here. Knight d7 is how Hans decided to continue, just developing this knight the other way. I continued with queen to c2. My opponent played c4, preparing, of course, to bring the knight in from d7 to c5 to d3. And in light of this threat, I decided it was time to kill my stupid a4 bishop in exchange for this really powerful knight. Of course, queen d7 was played, and now I do think white actually has a little bit of a comfortable advantage. Can bring a rook to the center, either rook really, or maybe bring this bishop off of this slightly loose square on f4. And yeah, I think white is a bit better here, thanks to this massive central d5 pawn. In the game, I went for a slightly strange idea. I play a4, trying to harass black's structure on the queen side, and black responds very naturally with the move e6. Of course, I don't want to be left with a weak isolated d-pawn, so I captured on e6. Black actually takes back with the pawn here, hoping to pressure, as I said, the slightly loose bishop on f4. I brought a rook to the center with tempo, queen c6, and bishop e3, just securing this bishop. And now, as you can see by the numerous arrows and circles on the board, I was hoping to put a piece on the d4 square, and I was feeling really good about my position. This was by far the best position I had against my opponent in all 8 games that we had played. And I was feeling pretty confident here that I wasn't going to get blown off the board anytime soon. That being said, Hans made a really interesting decision here, which I feel like might be pretty difficult to make. Black has this beautiful bishop on g7, bearing down on the long diagonal, and Hans actually plays this move e5, locking this bishop in, all in exchange for blocking my knight's access to d4. And I do think this turned out to be a good decision by black here. It's really effective on e5 at keeping my pieces out of the game. Here I start doing some slightly strange things. I think the best plan of attack for me is actually a move like knight g3, and the point is I'm doing a little dance with my knight, getting to e3, getting to d5. Instead, I try to double the rooks with a little fancy rook d5 here. Queen e6 is played, hitting my rook, and I step back to rook d2. I could have gone rook d2 immediately, but I felt that the queen was worse after moving from c6 because it wasn't putting some pressure on the queen side. Rook f d8, now rook a to d1, bishop f6, and I play the slightly weird queen b2. Not that it's a huge mistake or anything, just trying to put some pressure down the b file. Bishop c6 is very natural for black, pressuring my a pawn, and now I blunder! I go queen b4, thinking foolishly that I can push to a5. But of course this hangs the tactic, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, bishop e7, when my queen has nowhere to go. Look at all those squares controlled by the black pieces. My queen has to go back to b2, and this abandons the pawn on a4. So now I'm down a pawn, I'm sad, I'm so sad, Oh my, how sad am I? I had such a good position, and I immediately ruined it, as normal. But the game does not end here. I tried to go queen a1, putting some pressure on these pawns on the queen side. Bishop b5 by my opponent. I go rook b2, queen c6, keeping the bishop here, queen b1 to increase the pressure, but now the bishop actually just comes back to a4. And my major pieces are sort of looking at a very well defended pawn on b6. Finally, I kick it into gear and start improving this knight, going knight g3, knight f1, as previously mentioned, but now rook d8 by Hans Schmidt is just taking over the game. I go knight f1, rook d1 still comes, queen a2, king g7, king f2, trying to unpin, and sort of continue with this plan of knight e3. h5 comes on the board, just a nice space-gaining move by Hans. Go king e2. This rook does retreat back to d3. And now I would like you guys at home to try and find a way back into this game for white. If you sort of just sit here and do nothing, it feels like eventually my opponent was just going to be able to start pushing these guys, right? And I was going to be pretty helpless to stop this from happening. So a practical plan to get back into the game and at least give yourself some chances, right? I'm not saying white can survive this position. Probably white shouldn't. But there are some ways to make some practical opportunities for yourself. Okay, how can you do it? Well, first of all, you should of course start with bishop d2, defending the c3 pawn, and then, as I was highlighting with arrows, knight e3, knight d5, queen a1, queen e1, queen h4, and you go after this king on the dark squares. There you go. That's what those arrows meant. And I think this is the best practical try for white. Why is that? Well, by going after the king, you sort of make these extra pawns on the queen side less important for black, right? You know, obviously if these pawns queen, then I'm going to be in big trouble. But if black is sort of dilly-dallying, taking his time, maybe I can create some threats around this king and sort of, you know, change the story of the game, right? The story's not about these pawns, it's about this king, if I can help it. In the game, b5 was played, which is very natural. Good for black to push these guys, and I immediately play knight e3. a6 by Hans was a little bit weird. Much better to put this pawn to a5 directly, not like I really have threats against the b5 pawn. I continue with knight d5. We see the bishop come out to c5. It was under attack. And I continue now with queen a1 over to e1. Black perhaps realizes that the way forward is with a5 and does correct the small mistake here. And now after queen e1, perhaps my opponent was starting to feel the pressure around this king a little bit. He was staring down moves like queen h4 and not liking what he saw. So in the game, Hans Schmidt actually sacrifices his rook on d3 in exchange for this knight on d5 and the pawn on e4, and we had a little bit of a change. Now already, I think my position is far better off than it used to be, thanks to, of course, just by virtue of having an extra exchange. Why does that really improve my position? It's not like my rook is doing that much on b2, but in the long run, I might have some chances to do some strange-looking sacrifice and get back into some equal material endgame. That's obviously a long way off, though. In the game, I continue with queen h4, and the idea here, again, is to go after these dark squares around the king. Unfortunately for me, this does hang an immediate tactic that would pretty much end the game. And that tactic is, of course, queen d3 check, followed by bishop a3. This rook simply has nowhere to go. All the squares are defended, and rook a2 runs headfirst into queen b1 check when this rook is getting captured anyways. What I was sort of banking on is queen g5 with some kind of perpetual check, but it just turns out to not work. This queen is too close to the action. It's always going to be able to stop any perpetual ideas, and white is just dead lost in this position. Okay. In the game, none of that happened. Black played the move bishop b3 instead. I go queen g5. King f7 is a really nice find by Hans Schmidt. The point now being that this king is surprisingly resilient on this f7 square. I continue with queen h6, trying to go after the king from the side. But now queen d3 check comes, king e1, and this queen is a very nice defensive piece for black. And Hans immediately makes use of it by playing the move king g8, when suddenly I have no checks with my queen. The best I could find was to retreat with queen g5, going after this pawn. And now, I'm sort of on the clock here. This pawn is threatening to queen very, very rapidly, and I need to make concrete threats as soon as possible. I take back on e5, and then thanks to the amount of activity I managed to drum up around the king, managed to keep some chances alive. Hans finally slips here. He had been playing nearly perfectly for the entire game, at least in my opinion. Some small mistakes here, and then a pretty big mistake was not seeing this queen d3, bishop a3 win, but, understandable stuff. And here, there's actually only one move that wins for black. So if you do want to try to find it, I would encourage you to do so. But here's the answer. The only move that wins is the move a3. Why is this the only move that wins? Well, it attacks a rook on b2, and it is queening very, very quickly. But the way it wins is not very easy to find here. For example, white has an absolutely obscene move in this position to keep the game going. I sincerely doubt anybody at home could find this one. It is rook c2. Rook c2 keeps the game going. How so? Well, actually, black is unable to capture this rook without giving up a draw. It's as simple as that. Once again, I'm going to say that again. Black cannot capture this rook on c2, or else the game is drawn. If queen takes, then it just turns out that this is a simple perpetual. After queen e6, queen f6, queen e6, queen f6, if the king comes to f8, then bishop h6 is actually checkmate, so don't even think about it. And we will draw the game. If bishop takes, now very surprisingly, after queen takes c5, black has the absolutely ridiculous problem of losing the a-pawn by force. Yes, my king is on e1. Yes, these black pieces are surrounding it, but there's absolutely zero chance for black to defend this a-pawn. Why is that? Well, if it moves to a2, I can actually snake my way over to the a file and then pick up this a-pawn, all with check. For example, check, check. If you step to the 6th, I'll go queen a6, and if you step to the 8th, I'll go queen a8, and that pawn dies. In this position, after this a-pawn is gone, it's quite simply equal. If anything, white might be a bit better there, due to the safety of the king. So a3, the only move that wins, rook c2, and the way to win here is pretty simple. You just go something like queen d6 or directly a2, and the threats sort of dissipate for white with the black pieces still in the game. Don't fall for the hanging rook trick, just go a2 and you do win the game. Just had to highlight that line. In the game though, Hans chooses bishop f8, which looks like a great defensive move, but the problem now is that I can simply capture on b5. And I actually am tactically saving the game after the very natural move a3. How is that? Well, I can actually just take on b3, and there's an awkward pin that black has to deal with now on this pawn. a2 is still a winning try, but after queen a4, again, no way to save this pawn. If queen b1, I will just sacrifice for it and be in a pawn-up endgame. And here, this is black's best try, perhaps, but I am able to blockade this pawn, and white might be surviving here if, all goes well. In the game, though, Hans perhaps saw all this coming and goes king h7, which on its surface doesn't seem to do a whole lot, but if white is a little bit lax, now a3 will come, and the same line actually loses due to c takes b3, when I can no longer capture this piece with check, picking up the a-pawn. Of course, though, I just give check here, black blocks, and now after queen a7, I feel like white is actually the one in good control of the position. King g8 was played, I gave check, we repeated, g5 now, and I can actually activate these super sad pieces that have been here for the entire game with the move king f2. King g6 is played, queen a6 check, bishop f6, and here probably bishop e1 is best, getting the rook back into the game while keeping c3 guarded. I chose bishop e3 instead, aiming for the d4 square. This is of course a bit more double-edged after this pawn falls. I go rook d2, h4, and now unfortunately my head just wasn't in the right place to try to play this game for a win, In my head, I was still totally lost. Objectively looking at the position now, white is absolutely winning thanks to the activity of his pieces and the weakness of the black king. But in the game, I was just so convinced this a-pawn was going to queen and I was going to lose horribly. And I was unashamedly playing for the draw. So to win the game, white can try moves like g4, taking away some light squares from the black king. Moves like queen e6, queen c6, moves that go after this king on the light squares are all very, very strong. But I chose rook d6 instead, which gets checked. It's not too late to win with rook d2, sort of repeating. I went king a1, king e1 though. We repeated a while, and now after a3, the game is just going to be a draw. I go bishop d4, piling up on this bishop on f6. Now black is forced to take a perpetual, otherwise he will end up mated with this bishop falling off the board. And he checks me around for a little bit, and a draw by repetition occurs after queen d2 check. I really enjoyed this game. I enjoyed the chance to play such a super strong player in rapid chess. You don't get that kind of chance every day. I was a little bit unhappy with my overall result, which was 1/2 point to 7.5 points in his favor. But what can you do, man? The guy is super strong. That's just to be expected. Hopefully you guys really enjoyed this game. Let me know what you thought about this more analysis-focused type of video rather than, playing games. I enjoy it. I think I want to mix some of these in there. But yeah, let me know what else you want to see on this channel. I'm very open to suggestions. It is just starting out here, so sort of the world is your oyster. People in my comment section, tell me what you want, and I will do it. Alright guys, thank you again for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.